We're going to continue our event, and I would like to introduce you to our next panel, the tipping point, privacy regulations and the Internet of Things. Now, please meet Dan Caprio, co-founder of the Providence Group, and he's also Data Privacy Day chair. Basically, Dan is the chair of this event. Welcome, Dan. Michelle Dennedy is going to be on my furthest left, and she is going to, hopefully, Michelle, if you hear us, please join the panel.
1 minute away.
Okay, fantastic. Lori Fink, she's Chief Privacy Officer at AT&T, and Eve Mailer, Vice President of Innovation and Emerging Technologies at ForgeRock. Well, welcome everyone, and Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks everyone for joining us for this very important panel. We're obviously here today to celebrate Data Privacy Day, and you know, our topic is the Internet of Things, and our hope is that we can be informative, entertaining, and pithy. And keep the focus of our conversation this afternoon really on how do we protect consumers. Obviously, as we think about the Internet of Things, it's really about how do we protect privacy and security and enable innovation. And the Internet of Things is really a very broad ecosystem. There's lots of different definitions. You know, we can think about it in very practical terms, in terms of connected devices, smart cities, smart cars, wearables, et cetera. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about the Internet of Things. But like I said, today, because we're celebrating Data Privacy Day, we really want to focus on how we can protect consumers and the consumer side. So, Michelle, was thinking we could start off with you, just for kind of a quick level set for what do you believe is the current state of the Internet of Things?
The current state of privacy in the Internet of Things, or the current state of the Internet of Things?
The Internet of Things, as the overall state, but as it relates to privacy.
I think that the Internet of Things is not a new concept. I think it's a concept we've had for a long time. I think we've gone through waves, right? So we had RFID was the mark of the beast, you know, back when they were marking pallets, and we went through that iteration. I think the state of architecture beneath the Internet of Things that will bring us great value and protect against great risk is primordial.
Primordial, can you go a little deeper on that?
As in soup?
Yeah.
We're in the soup now.
As in soup. I think we're just beginning. There are a number of architectural frameworks and methodologies that people are using, but I think mostly we are in a feature-driven world. Is it on? Is it on? Is it on? What's it saying? What's it saying? What's it saying? Not necessarily what is the volume of data? How is it proportionate to what I thought it was going to be used for? Should I keep the data? All of these things I think are in a very primitive state, and I think there's a ton of innovation to be done if we believe that this wave of the Internet of Things is going to bring us the promise that we think it can.
Okay. So we're kind of at the beginning of the beginning, even though a lot of us have been thinking about this for 10 or 15 years. So really kind of a question for Lori and Eve to pick up on Michelle. You know, we talk about this a lot in terms of there's a lot of hype, you know, but we tend to get a lot of reporting in terms of what are the opportunities, what are the challenges. How do you all see that, and you know, and then how does that relate to what we can be doing to protect consumers?
Yeah, I'll kick it off, Eve, and then you chime in, and Michelle. I think, you know, sometimes when we think about the Internet of Things, and I use cargo tracking as a prime example, you brought that up, you know, you put a sensor on a personal piece of property, you put it on a truck, and you track it from point A to point B. It is great for the business. From a privacy perspective, it's kind of a non-event, you know, but then you start going to smart cities, and you start looking at data patterns, and you're aggregating individual information, but in a way that it can't be re-identified. And you're using it to try to help you divert traffic congestion. That's a positive. Now, take the smart city example and think about putting a sensor on an individual home's water meter. Now it starts to feel a little more personal, and I think how people react to it also shifts with that.
Yeah, so I think that we were talking about smart meters earlier,
Yes.
and I think that it's such a great example of the nexus between industrial IoT and consumer IoT, because it's part of kind of a country's infrastructure, and yet it sits in your home. And so I always take this digital identity-centric view. This is, what my company does. And what I do is I drive our privacy and consent innovation. So I'm not, sort of in charge of the risk management view of the universe. I'm in charge of actually identity-centric consent solutions and privacy solutions. And so I have to sort of think about that continuum of, well, okay, not to put too fine a point on it, but the fear, greed kind of coming together around in a circle. And so we have to think about the architecture, and you use that word architecture, and that's what it's all about, that has...
Me very well.
We go way back, you and me. Security and privacy, and I'm going to say this word consent, with an identity-centric view, because you have to tie together a device identity and a person identity, and maybe multiple persons' identities. Now we get into householder views, and I know you know that well from just a subscriber view of the universe. You have to bind those appropriately, securely, and then you have to unbind them at the right time. And in the case of a smart meter, a house or a house meter has a life cycle, and then a person who moves in and out of a house has a life cycle that differs. And you've got to unbind it at the right time. Now, we know how to do this. We just have to do it. And it has to be, the old saying, you have to build it in and not bolt it on.
Right.
And when you think about, home automation, home security, you get into that too. Obviously, when someone enters a home and they leave a home, in our space, it's called digital life is our service. Mm-hmm. That's very personal, very sensitive. But the use of that data is associated with the providing of that service. So to your question of how do you bind it with the service, how do you unbind it when you no longer need it, those are questions that people have to grapple with and people have to get comfortable with.
Right. Well, as we think about the Internet of Things and the 21st century technology and what that can mean for economic growth and convenience and quality of life, what do you all see, and kind of throw it to all three of you, sort of two questions, but what do you see as the role of government to protect consumers? And then on the other side is, what do you see as the role of industry? What are you all doing on the industry side, all day, every day, as you think about protecting consumers? And how do you see those different roles? Maybe Michelle, you want to take it first?
Dan. How to behave.
Or not behave.
There's duct tape right up front here. So what is the role of government and the role of private? I think in so many discussions of technology, the easy glib thing is, don't tread on me, man. Let us innovate. We'll figure it out. Dude, we'll catch up later, dude. I think those days are past of there's a role. I love this woman, by the way. I was like, I think there's a role to be played of what is the objective of the governmental intervention. Sometimes it's clarity, sometimes it's awareness. Hopefully it's not limitation of innovation, but I think also without boundaries and requirements, it's difficult for imaginative, newer technology, or technology in the case of IoT that's harnessing a lot of known streams that on their own may be discrete pools and owned by discrete players, collectively create a quantitative and a qualitative difference. So I think that there is a blended responsibility, and part of what I would say to data privacy awareness is, if you are a technologist who has a great widget idea innovation in IoT, but you haven't simplified how you think that flow is limited, what is your best guess for control schemas in the future, or governance or transparency, get on that. Map out your new innovation in terms of where it will be when it's instantiated, what happens if everyone on the planet adopts your innovation, and have some ideas, and then get yourself to Sacramento, get yourself to DC, and have that conversation sooner rather than later.
Do you see those conversations taking place? Because that's a great idea.
I think not often enough. I mean, I'm at Cisco. We have a full-on, wonderful privacy business, or a privacy partnership with our government affairs people globally. Not every startup has that, but every startup does have email. Every startup does have Twitter. And all these other free ways of communicating. This is where I am. This is what I'm doing. Is there another community of like-minded innovators? That doesn't mean you share your secret sauce necessarily, but I think we have seen enough times in the past, and I'll point to an AT&T example that way predates your role there, Lori. There was a sort of renegade group of AT&Ters. This is dating myself, maybe 15 years ago, and they created this group called Nebuad. And Nebuad was brilliant. It said that the likelihood of the people you actually dial on your AT&T service is probably more instructive to ad providers than anything you go on a search engine and browse. And that assumption is correct psychologically. And what they did not do after taking $50 million of VC money is go to DC and explain how they were going to control the ad tech. They were not associated with AT&T anymore when they started their company, but they were right on the substance. If the only thing in the world that was going to happen was good ad searching and connectivity with coupons, they were very, very desperately wrong on the innovation perspective of, is this a sustainable use of this type of data that always existed and was always semi-public, but was never used in that way before. So it's one of these kind of cautionary tales of Silicon Valley that's fortunately old enough that nobody cares anymore, but it was a prime example of you should have gotten and talked to Senator Markey because he was the one that was like, goodbye, flame.
Well, and the other thing about that, and we'll bring Eve and Lori into this, but the market sorted that out very quickly. I mean, that's a painful example.
One hearing started that out.
Yes, and that was about the end of it. I mean,
$50 million later.
I know, but the market, I mean, the market spoke loudly. So, Eve, what do you think? Sort of role of government, role of industry? How do you play it?
I want to point out a couple of instances where individual consumers have been given control of data access through no pressure of government and compliance and privacy regulations, and they've been under our noses all this time, and they're instructive. When we look at, I'm not talking about social share buttons here. I'm talking about if you look at something like Google Docs, and you have a share button to what can be very sensitive data, and we don't think of this as consent, but it's a very powerful, proactive kind of consent we give.
I think it's assent rather than consent.
It's more powerful because it's without external influence, and we can constrain it. This is what you'd call constrained delegation of access, and you can revoke it anytime you want in a fine grain. And that's user control.
What would that mean, though? I mean, sort of in layman's terms to the average consumer,
Well, it's not what they'd call privacy, in fact, because it's better.
Okay.
I'd call it selective sharing, and in fact, it's a continuum. Privacy, the P word has been so attenuated into this, I call it a fetal crouch. Don't touch my stuff. And it's a shame because it's turned into a totally compliance conversation. Overrun, by lawyers. I actually collect lawyers, and I'll tell you, I've told a lot of people this. You look up the collective noun for lawyers, and it's a disputation of lawyers. Somebody was having fun. It is. I collect lawyers because, I work on a standard called user-managed access, and my company has implemented this standard. A number of companies have been implementing the standard. It's based on another standard called OAuth, and OAuth is behind a lot of the flows that you engage in online when you safely, securely do things like what's behind single sign-on. And that's what kind of the share button and, all those things are about. And those are empowering people without any compliance rationale for doing so.
But I think this goes so down to your question of like the private-public partnership is when OAuth, which is when
Exactly.
we first started working together on federated identities way back
Exactly.
in the day, there was a commercial benefit. There were a ton of individuals within big organizations that believed in it from a moral and ethical and cultural standpoint.
It was product functionality.
product
wasn't moral and
functionality.
ethical. It was.
But it was also that.
It was top
For me,
line of the
it was
business.
that.
It was because you want to give users, in fact, you see it in Apple Care Kit as well. You see, and similar. And IoT is a major driver of, I need or want to share this with somebody else. And it's not just data. It goes beyond data.
Yeah.
It's functionality of, I want to share access to my car to somebody, like driving it but not getting to the trunk, or vice versa. And this is so powerful. If we conceive of privacy as only sharing data and only being asked by somebody who wants to get something from me and I don't trust them, and not seeing the full continuum, we're not speaking to the business side of the business. We're speaking only to the risk management people, and we're missing something.
So take us to the strategic level, Lori. How do you see it?
I think what you've hit on is that, especially in the IoT space, there is such a range of data being collected, data being used. Some of it makes people uncomfortable, some of it doesn't. But when you look at the role of government, you look at the role of industry, to me it boils down to two things. It's balance and flexibility.
Yeah.
You've really got to have balance, the risk of the types of data you're using, and you also have the flexibility based on that, so that not every data element is treated the same. And then I think as you develop that, your goal should be, the goal of government should be to enable innovation in a safe, private-centric way. From an industry perspective, they have to be able, Michelle, this is your point, to tell the story about why this is important and what benefits it brings. And that's where privacy becomes a differentiator in your products, in your services, and in how you communicate it.
Right.
But it becomes more of a strategic aspect, not just something that is a check the box like we talked about.
Exactly.
And if you can offer control, transparency is like step one. Yep. Control is step two, and that's why I call it selective sharing. That becomes a differentiator, in fact.
Right.
I think the Department of Commerce issued their report last week. I'd encourage people to read it, but it talks about a multi-stakeholder approach, and it talks about industry being at the table and multiple agencies, and it's not just privacy, it's security, it's multiple other things. So I think we saw the FTC do similar things too last year. So I think there's some, encouraging things happening in this space, and we need to be a voice in it.
Yeah, it seems like, 2017 really is, we've said this for 10 years, but 2017 really is the year, I think, for leadership, especially industry leadership in the Internet of Things. Particularly with all the security stories, the DDoS attack, the dying DDoS attack, and what that means, for the domain name system, and not to geek out on the security side, but part of the panel is we really are at an inflection point, and we've talked about privacy and security by design, and you all are doing it all day, every day, but it really is time to begin to put some of these things in place, to begin to think about, to make every day Data Privacy Day. And in fact, not to be too colloquial, but we need to put consumers at the center of the experience.
I almost want to break out into song. I can't really say it better than that.
I can write lyrics
and I
for
will.
that. Let's do it.
So as we think about that, though, we've talked about the IoT and the ecosystem and it being diverse. How can a company address the differences that are inherent in the different types of solutions, while we still maintain consistent rules on the use of personal information? Can you give some examples of that?
I'll start and then you guys chime in, but I kind of break it into two categories. What is the sensitivity of the data you're using, and what is a particular use case? And you make it really simplistic at the get-go, which is, does it involve personally identifiable information? And if it doesn't, could it be combined with other data sets that might make it personally identifiable? And you think of these, you go through these different aspects of it, and if it's aggregate and anonymized, do you trust your techniques? In our case, we created a data advisory board where we bring in external academics and technologists to really let us pressure test or have them pressure test our techniques. So I think there's a lot of things you can do, and data associated with a wearable is really, really personal. So you're going to want to handle that and manage that differently. But, the data associated with, the cargo tracking, not so much. There's nothing there that causes concern.
Right.
Maybe I'll pile on and then maybe Michelle can go next. An example I like to think of is, I'll take the fitness wearable and think about it in the context of you run a gym and you hand out a bunch of fitness wearables to everybody, all your gym members in one class for an hour, and then you hand out fitness wearables to the next class the next hour. And with my kind of identity-centric brain, I'm thinking, okay, now it's a matter of the binding again. So you want each person's data to go with them, and each device has got its own identity. So what you're talking about is relationships, essentially. Relationships between devices and people's cloud accounts, essentially. And in fact, the way we think about it, at ForgeRock anyway, is it's identity relationship management. And once you get into devices and how many more devices people have and companies have and all those associations, the more identities you're managing, and that goes for people as well as organizations, the more the relationships matter. Because soon you're into the trillions, you're talking real numbers. And the relationships become all. So it puts a pressure on IT just to manage the numbers. It puts a pressure on the architecture you've chosen, and it puts a pressure on the privacy stance you took, which is why, you see with things like the General Data Protection Regulation, it defined consent a little harder. It defined it to be a little bit tougher to do. And this is why I kind of rail against the risk management perspective alone, and the multi-stakeholder approach is so important, because you go to somebody who has that approach and they say, don't go for the consent standard, it's hard. And I go, but how do you achieve trustworthiness with those people? So I say, lean into consent. And that's why you have to base your architecture on the presumption that you're going to have to ask them what they want done with their data, and then do it.
I think that's good. And I think it's interesting because I think we now also have data, and I do love data. On Data Privacy Day, I love data. And you do see the ForgeRock clone wannabes that are gone now. Mm. It's hard work to perform the rigor of architecture. It's hard work to identify those use cases and track them over time. But it's that hard work that brings that value. It's the same thing as anything else. I could slap together a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for you. I would find a way to mess that up. Somebody who is like chronically working on their craft and making it better and better and better and having a routine way of doing it can scale and make a better peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Someone out there is thinking Arthur Dent right now, the perfect sandwich, right?
Perfect. I was kind of thinking that. But I also was thinking, I think the other thing that constantly has to be pressure tested, and this is where I think multi-stakeholders are very useful, is how useful is it? In the IoT world, if anyone here ever says to me, I could put a gallon of milk in it and it's going to tell you when it's gone bad. I already have an Internet of Thing that does that. And if I'm too stupid to use it, or I'm constantly drinking sour milk, maybe I like it. I don't know.
Right.
Find me something that's valuable. Find me something that makes my life better. For 2 years ago, we were all wearing our little bands. I'm wearing my wearables. They're pants. They're too tight. I need to eat less and move more. Bring us value use cases. The 1950s absolute revolution, one of the most revolutionary thing to international trade. Can anyone guess what it is? One guess.
Standard shipping container size.
Damn it, you already know the answer. Standard shipping container size.
Both ex-son, so that's why I know.
Exactly.
What's the analog for the Internet of Things?
Well, so here's the analog for the Internet of Things. So the reason the shipping container was so profoundly important is before it came along, things were rotting on the docks. Why? Because there wasn't a ship? No. Because you had to strap it down and make sure it was load balanced, and then you had to wait for enough like-kind goods to come. Right now, we need a shipping container to contain and federalize and mark the data packages that are flowing between and among the IoT systems across the networks so that we can not have to wait for a standard to emerge of the band. We will understand how do EHR records work and how do I actually get that band to be smarter than my pants. How do we figure out how to tie it to my phone activities and my schedule to like send a pop-up to my EA to say, she will take no more meetings today, she is too fat, send her on a run. That's when the shipping container that is
the value of standards, and this is,
we love me a standard.
And when you asked about what should industry do, it's standards. And this is why we have an IoT conversation now.
It's not the same as generic.
No.
Standards are sexy.
Why we have the IoT conversation now, why it started in 2014, was APIs and the standardization of security and identity and access control, and yes, consent over APIs. And it started with, I talked about OAuth, and it's OAuth and OpenID Connect, and now user-managed access. These have accelerated. To the extent we have any security right now in IoT, it's because of the web standards. Right. More has to come.
Let's do one more quick question as we're about to wrap up here. And maybe Lori, you can take this. I mean, Michelle just mentioned GDPR. We obviously, we live in a global world. The Internet of Things is a global phenomena. How does a company like AT&T? I mean, how do you sort that all out? I mean, on different continents and different cultures, and that privacy is contextual, and that the Internet of Things is kind of the it's multinational, but how do you rationalize that for consumers? How do you do it?
So to me, this is my favorite topic, because in the Internet of Things, interoperability is really key to what we're doing cross-country, across states, across localities. And I will tell you, going back in the not too distant past, AT&T's consumer business was really a domestic-focused business. So what happened in my space was mergers. Suddenly we had a wireless consumer business in Mexico. We had satellite television in Latin America. And then we had GDPR, e-privacy. And suddenly we said, whoa, we need to take a step back and really look at how do you build a global program, not just a domestic-based program. And how do you look at, so what do we think about? We really focus on making sure we're thinking about cross-border data mechanism. That's critical. And when we look at the infrastructure that GDPR and the ARCO rights in Mexico require, we say, okay, let's step back and say, those are requirements, but if we're building a global program, what can we learn from those requirements? And how do we set up an infrastructure when we're looking at technology that can be scalable when and if we're ready to take that next step to build the program? So I think it's been key, and it's made us, sometimes you say it forces you into a different place, but I think it made us look at our program and our governance and how we can be a better innovator with the business as we move forward in this privacy space.
Great. Well, I think we've run out of time, so you got the final word. Thank you to our panel. Let's join me in a round of applause.
Thanks, Dan.